spotted her first from the tree line, high up on the frozen ridge. A lone woman in a beat-up brown coat, dragging a log almost twice her size across hard, frozen Montana ground. The sky was the color of old tin. Her breath came out in rough white clouds, but she didn't slow down. Not once. He'd ridden past this stretch of land every morning for nearly 3 weeks now. Every time, he told himself he was just checking his fence line, just looking after his cattle, just passing by. But that was a lie, and he knew it. His chest tightened the way it always did when the past showed up uninvited. He'd buried his wife and their unborn child on a cold hill 2 winters back, and with them, he'd buried any thought of starting anything new. Yet here he was, watching a stranger try to build a life from scratch. Below him, the woman worked like she'd been born to it. She rolled the log into place beside a half-built cabin frame, then knelt and began carving notches with a small, sharp hatchet. Her movements were practiced, almost stubborn. No neighbors, no wagon, no extra set of hands. Just her, a skeleton of a cabin, and a wide, empty stretch of land the town folks called Bitter Creek. Her name, he'd heard in whispers at the general store, was Nora James, a widow. Some said trouble followed her. Some said she was the trouble. Out here, gossip traveled faster than stagecoaches. Luke didn't care much for rumors. What he cared about was the way she moved. The way her jaw clenched when the wind cut across the valley. The way her shoulders shook for half a second when she thought nobody was looking. Grief knew its own kind. He saw that same hollow, determined look in her face that he'd once seen in his mirror before he'd stopped looking altogether. "Why are you out here alone?" he muttered under his breath. Soft tone. Women didn't just ride into the Montana frontier and start raising cabins by themselves, not unless life had already burned everything else to the ground. His horse shifted under him, picking up on his unease. Luke tightened the reins, torn between riding down to help and turning his back. Getting involved felt wrong, almost like betrayal. His late wife, Anna, had once talked about building a small place by the creek, a house they never got the chance to raise. Watching another woman do what Anna never lived to do felt like someone rubbing salt into a cut that never healed. He should leave. He knew that. Nora straightened suddenly, fingers pressed against the small of her back, and for some reason Luke held his breath. She turned and looked straight toward the ridge. Their eyes met across the cold distance. For a long, thin heartbeat, neither of them moved. The November wind howled between them, carrying the smell of snow and pine. Then Luke jerked his horse backward into the shadows of the trees, as if he'd been caught doing something indecent. The pine swallowed him up, and when Nora looked again, all she saw was the empty ridge. She went back to work, but her hands shook just a little as she reached for the next log. Snow started falling before noon, slow at first, soft flakes drifting sideways on the wind. Nora ignored it. She'd worked through weather far worse. But by late afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised gray, and the wind hit with the force of a kicked-in door. She grabbed the roll of canvas from the ground and hauled it toward the half-built walls. The tarp whipped violently, snapping like an angry animal. Her fingers went numb, tying the first corner down. She was losing the race against the storm. A sharp gust ripped one rope free, nearly yanking her off her feet. "Come on," she muttered, voice cracking in frustration. She lunged for the rope again. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Nora spun, snatching the rifle, leaning against a post. Her pulse hammered hard enough to shake her grip. Through the white curtain of driving snow, a dark figure emerged. A man on horseback, leading a second pack horse weighed down with gear. For a second, she saw the ridge in her mind. The Watcher. And now he was here. The man swung off his horse without a word, as if the storm didn't even exist, and began unloading supplies. Heavy canvas, a coil of new rope, nails, even 2 bundles of dried meat wrapped in cloth. Nora raised her rifle higher. "I don't need charity." He didn't flinch, just kept tying one end of the canvas to a log with controlled, practiced motions. "Not charity," he said, voice low and rough. "Just sense. This storm will peel that tarp clean off by midnight." "And what's your price for this sense?" she asked, tightening her grip. At that, he finally stopped working and met her eyes. Really met them. There was no greed in his face, no condescension, just the weary loneliness of a man who'd lived too much life in too short a time. "You want me gone?" "After it's tied down," he said softly, "I'll ride out." Something in her, something worn thin by months of scraping by alone, recognized the truth in his voice. She slowly lowered the rifle but didn't set it aside. "Fine, help. But don't think this means anything." They worked side by side in wordless, tense silence. Snow collected on his hat brim and darkened his coat. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man who'd built things his whole life. He tied stronger knots than she knew how to make, braced weak corners she hadn't noticed, and reinforced the frame using tricks she'd only seen seasoned carpenters use. By full dark, the cabin held firm against the storm's fury. He stepped back, breathing hard, and walked toward his horse without waiting for thanks. "Wait," Nora called. He turned. "What's your name?" "Luke Hartley." She nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. He touched the brim of his hat in a quiet acknowledgement, then disappeared into the whirling snow like he'd been part of the storm itself. Nora stood in the dim orange glow of her small fire, the wind screaming around her, wondering why a stranger would help her when the world never had. Sunday mornings in Bitter Creek always felt colder than the rest of the week, and not because of the weather. People gathered in their best clothes, their best smiles, and their sharpest judgments. Luke Hartley sat in the back row of the small timber church, hat in his hands, eyes unfocused as the Reverend's sermon droned on. His mind drifted, not to scripture, not to ranch business, but to the woman fighting the storm 3 nights earlier. Nora James had changed something in him. He didn't like that, didn't know what to do with it. Heads turned instantly, 40 sets of eyes locking onto the latecomer. Nora stepped inside, snow still clinging to the hem of her skirt, chin raised just enough to show she wasn't afraid, even if she should have been. She chose the only open seat, the very front row, exposed and alone. Behind her, Clara Whitfield, the town's self-appointed gatekeeper, leaned toward her daughter and whispered loud enough for half the congregation to hear, "Some women just don't know their place. Building a cabin alone? Shameful behavior." Luke's jaw tightened. The service kept rolling, but he barely heard a word. His mind drifted back 2 years ago to the night he lost Anna. Fever had taken her fast. Too fast. He'd waited too long to fetch the doctor. He'd convinced himself she would recover. She didn't, and he'd carried that weight like a stone strapped to his ribs ever since. His ranch thrived, his reputation stood solid, but he walked through life like a ghost. When the service ended, Clara positioned herself on the church steps like a spider in a web, waiting for Nora to pass. And Nora did, head high, eyes forward. The murmur swelled as she moved through the crowd. Luke watched, heart knocking hard in his chest. He had a choice: stay back and let the town swallow her whole, or step into the line of fire with her. He chose, finally. He walked across the churchyard, boots crunching on frost, and nodded to her. Just a simple greeting, but it was loud enough to silence the chatter around them. Clara's voice cut through the chill. "Interesting company you're keeping, Mr. Hartley." Luke paused. The whole congregation held its breath. He could step back into the safe shadows. Or he could take the first real risk since the night Anna died. "Miss James," he said instead, tipping his hat. Nora blinked in surprise. "Mr. Hartley, storm didn't take your walls down." "No," she said, "thanks to you." That afternoon, Luke rode to Bitter Creek, not to the distant ridge, but directly to Nora's half-built home. She watched him approach, one hand resting on the hammer at her belt. Luke dismounted, grabbed a saw from her tool pile, and met her eyes with quiet conviction. "If you'll have the help, I'll help you build." Nora studied him long and hard, reading the truth beneath the silence. Finally, she nodded. "Then you'd better know how to square a beam properly." The distance between them, once a chasm, closed just a little. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that neither Luke nor Nora tried to name. Dawn to dusk, they worked side by side. No wasted words, no awkward explanations, just the steady thud of axes, the rasp of saws, and the quiet understanding that built itself between them like an invisible framework. Luke showed her tricks he'd learned years ago: how to read a log's grain before cutting, how to brace a joint so the whole structure held firm through winter storms, how to test balance with a simple palm press. Nora learned fast, faster than most ranch hands he'd hired. Sometimes their hands brushed while passing a tool. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the spark. Evenings brought a small fire, a shared meal, and long stretches of silence weighted with meaning instead of loneliness. One night, as orange firelight flickered on the cabin's growing walls, Luke finally asked the question he'd held back. "Your husband, he ever build before?" Nora didn't flinch. "Eli?" She shook her head. "No, he was a ranch hand. Got himself caught in a land dispute last spring. Wrong place, wrong temper." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but the way her jaw tightened told the rest. Folks had blamed him, branded her by association. "Town's good at pointing fingers," Luke said quietly. She looked at him, really looked. "So's grief." The next morning, trouble arrived on silent feet. Half her firewood pile, weeks of hard work, was gone. Tracks led off toward the foothills, messy and overlapping. Nora's face went pale with anger. "I needed that wood to get through winter," she muttered. "I'll track it," Luke said. "It's not on you." "It is," he answered simply. He followed the tracks 5 miles to a small drifter camp. 4 men, half drunk, bragging around a smoky fire. Luke didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. Whatever they saw in his eyes froze the words in their throats. They handed the wood back without a fight. When he returned to Nora, she stood waiting, arms folded tight across her chest. "You didn't have to do that." Luke met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "I did." That night he dreamed of Anna. He woke tangled in guilt, helping Nora, feeling something shift inside him. Felt too much like turning his back on the woman he'd lost. The next morning, Nora sensed it before he said a word. She set down her hammer and stepped closer. "You're not betraying anyone by living," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "The dead don't want us frozen with them." Her words hit him harder than any winter wind. Something cracked open in him, quiet, painful, necessary. He nodded once, unable to trust his voice, and threw himself into the work with a new urgency, as if building the cabin might also build something inside him. Then the blizzard hit, without warning. One moment, they were setting the last roof beams. The next, the world went white so fast it stole their breath. The wind screamed around them. Snow cut sideways. Visibility vanished. "Inside!" Luke shouted. They stumbled into the half-finished cabin, sealing the canvas gaps as best they could. The small stove struggled against the cold. The walls groaned, but held. For 2 days, the storm trapped them. Two people, one wool blanket, and the slow unthawing of walls they'd each built around their hearts. The storm swallowed the world whole. Winds slammed against the canvas-covered walls, forcing icy drafts through every gap in the half-finished cabin. The stove crackled weakly, too small for a storm this mean, but it was all they had. Luke and Nora huddled close, sharing a single wool blanket, boots still on, shoulders brushing with every shiver. Neither spoke at first. The howling wind did all the talking. 2 days of confinement can peel layers off a person, and the storm had nothing but time. By the second night, the silence finally cracked. Luke stared into the flickering firelight, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about him, your husband." Nora didn't answer right away. She watched the flames dance in the stove's narrow window, her expression caught somewhere between memory and exhaustion. "Eli wasn't perfect," she said at last. "Quick temper, bad judge of men, but he wasn't the monster folks said he was. He worked hard, tried harder, loved me in the way he knew how." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth stripped to the bone. "I loved him," she added softly, "but he's gone, and I'm still here, still trying to live." She hesitated, then glanced at him. "What about your wife?" Luke swallowed hard. "Anna died in the fever 2 years ago. Lost the baby with her." Nora's breath hitched, sympathy flickering in her eyes. "I should have ridden for the doctor sooner," Luke continued, voice cracking despite his best effort. "I kept thinking she'd get better. I watched her fade instead, and ever since, I've been watching life, not living it." He scrubbed a hand over his face, ashamed of the vulnerability spilling out. "Watching you from that ridge," he confessed, "felt safer than stepping into anything real." The wind wailed around the cabin, but inside, a different kind of tension filled the air. Nora turned toward him fully, her face lit by the warm glow of the fire. "Luke," she said quietly, "you don't honor the dead by dying with them. You honor them by living." The words hung between them, heavy and daring. Luke looked at her, really looked, saw someone just as bruised by life, just as stubbornly surviving. Something unspoken bridged the space between them. He leaned in, tentative, terrified, honest. Nora froze for half a heartbeat, then closed the space herself. Their kiss was slow, unsure, the kind that could shatter or save a person depending on which way they leaned. When they pulled apart, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The storm raged on, but something inside the cabin had shifted, quiet, fragile, real. Morning arrived like a mercy. The world outside sparkled under fresh snow. The storm finally spent. They stepped out into the silence, standing shoulder to shoulder. They worked differently now, in sync, aware, careful. And though neither dared name what had changed, they both felt it like a new warmth beneath the ice. Just after noon, Moses rode up on horseback, snow dusting his coat. His expression said everything. "Boss," he muttered, glancing between them. "Town's talking. Clara Whitfield's got her claws out." Luke's stomach tightened. In a small town, rumors spread quicker than prairie fire. But Nora lifted her chin. "Let them talk," she said. Luke wished he believed he could. Rumors in Bitter Creek traveled faster than a river in spring thaw. By the end of the week, half the town had convinced itself that Nora James and Luke Hartley were living in sin, plotting land deals, or both. Truth didn't matter much in a place starved for excitement. Luke tried to brush it off, but the weight of reputation, something he'd clung to for 2 hollow years, pressed hard on his chest. He'd always been the dependable rancher, the quiet widower folks respected. Now looks followed him everywhere. Curious looks, judgmental ones. He tried to keep working at Nora's cabin as if nothing had changed, but the tension grew thick enough to taste. Nora felt it. He knew she did. 7 days after the storm, the town council called a public concern meeting in the square, something they only did when they wanted a spectacle. Clara Whitfield stood at the center like she owned the dirt under her feet, flanked by Vernon Hale, a rancher with a grudge and a hungry look. Luke approached, shoulders tight, jaw locked. He sensed eyes on him from every direction. Old friends, ranchers, townsfolk who'd once offered him nothing but respect. Now their faces were carved from stone. Clara's voice rang out sharp as frostbite. "We're troubled, Mr. Hartley, by your association with certain individuals. This community has standards. Nora stood at the edge of the crowd, half hidden near the mercantile steps. She wasn't supposed to be there. He'd hoped she'd stay away, but she'd come for supplies and walked straight into the fire. He forced his voice steady. Miss James is a widow trying to build a life. I'm helping a neighbor. Vernon let out a cold laugh. Helping? You sure that's all you're calling it these days? A ripple went through the crowd. Luke's heart hammered. He knew what he wanted to say, felt it rise like a storm inside him. But years of keeping his head down held him silent. The hesitation lasted a breath too long, and in that breath, everything broke. Nora's face stiffened. Hurt flickered through her eyes, quick, sharp, undeniable. She didn't push through the crowd, didn't shout, didn't demand he defend her. She just turned, mounted her horse, and rode away. Luke's chest caved inward. He felt something inside him collapse, something that had only just begun to live again. He left the meeting without another word. He tried riding after her, but when he reached her cabin, the door was barred. His knock echoed hollow in the cold air. You chose their approval, Nora said through the wood, her voice calm but stripped raw. I choose myself. Go home, Luke. Nothing, he said, mattered. She didn't open the door. That afternoon, Vernon Hale filed a legal claim against Nora's land, saying it wasn't occupied full-time, that her late husband left unpaid debts, that the territory had the right to reassign abandoned claims. The council didn't stop him. Clara probably handed him the pen. Nora now had 2 weeks to finish her cabin and prove full residence, or lose everything. Luke rode home, shame sitting so heavy on him it felt like another rider gripping his shoulders. Moses, waiting at the barn, didn't soften his words. You spent 2 years dead inside, boss, he said quietly. That woman brought you back, and now you're crawling right back into the grave. Luke didn't argue, because Moses was right. The next 10 days carved themselves into Luke like knife marks. He went through the motions, feeding cattle, checking fences, moving through ranch chores like a man underwater. But nothing reached him. Nora, meanwhile, worked alone. He could see the smoke from her cabin's fire pit from miles away, rising thin and desperate into the cold air. He imagined her struggling to lift beams without help. Imagined the pain in her injured hand. Imagined the slow collapse of her dream under exhaustion and frost. He'd done this. He'd left her to fend for herself when she needed someone to stand beside her. Every night he sat at his kitchen table with a bottle he barely tasted, staring at the door as if courage might walk through it. It didn't. Moses watched him with a mix of pity and frustration. The old foreman had been with Luke's family long enough to speak truth without flinching. One morning, as Luke sat hunched over his coffee, Moses leaned on the counter and said in a low voice, Anna wouldn't want this from you. Luke's jaw clenched. Boy, I knew her since she was 10. And I know this, she'd be ashamed you're giving up on life, not for moving on. You think loving again is betrayal? The betrayal is you letting yourself rot. Luke didn't answer. His throat burned. That truth hit harder than any fist ever could. Later that afternoon, snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting down like quiet reminders. Luke saddled his horse without thinking, his hands moving faster than his mind. Something inside him had snapped loose. He rode to the cemetery. The cold wind pushed against him, but he didn't slow. He stopped at the small headstone under the old pine tree. Anna Hartley carved in simple letters he still couldn't bear to look at for long. For a long moment, he couldn't breathe. Then the words came, raw and shaking. I loved you, Anna. God knows I did. I'll always carry you. His voice broke, dropping into a whisper. But I'm still here, and I've been choosing wrong, choosing fear, choosing to stay dead with you. Snow settled on his coat, on the stone, on the ground around him like a blanket. He placed one hand against the cold marker. She makes me feel alive, he said, barely audible, and I think you'd want that for me. Saying it didn't erase the pain, but it loosened something that had been locked tight for 2 long years. Permission didn't come from the dead, it came from himself. Luke climbed back on his horse with one truth burning through him. He was done letting fear make his choices. He rode straight to Bitter Creek, headed for the one place he'd avoided for too long. The council's meeting place. He was done being silent. Luke pushed open the swinging saloon doors with a force that rattled the hinges. The room went quiet. Cards paused midair, drinks halfway to lips, conversations dying on the spot. The council was gathered around a long table in the back, pretending they were discussing legal matters when everyone knew they were planning how to strip a widow of her land. Vernon Hale turned first, smug and certain. Clara Whitfield stood beside him, stiff as a fence post, chin raised like she smelled something unpleasant. Luke dropped a stack of papers onto the bar so hard dust puffed into the air. This claim against Nora James, he said, voice echoing sharp and clear, is built on lies. People froze. Even the piano player's hands halted above the keys. Luke's voice grew stronger, steadier. Eli James's debts were paid off months ago. I have the receipts right here. Vernon knew it. The council knew it. This wasn't about justice. This was about stealing her land. Clara stepped forward, trying to regain control. This isn't about land, it's about... Luke cut her off. It's about cruelty dressed up as righteousness. Gasps rippled across the saloon. Clara's cheeks flushed crimson. Luke turned his gaze to the room. The same faces that had judged him, the same people he'd let intimidate him into silence a week earlier. Nora James is braver, stronger, and kinder than half this town put together, he said. You want to judge her? Then you can judge me right along with her. I stand with Nora James. The words struck the room like a struck match. Bright, dangerous, impossible to ignore. Vernon stepped forward, face twisted. You think anyone cares who you stand with? You're just a rancher who can't see when he's being played. Luke stepped closer until they were eye to eye. I see a man who wants land so bad he'd trample a widow to get it. The room shifted, lines being drawn in real time. Younger families, tired of Clara's grip on the town, moved to Luke's side. The blacksmith crossed his arms and grunted, reckon she deserves fairness. Others nodded, a quiet rebellion forming, and then Moses stepped forward from the corner, voice rough as gravel. She's building something with more heart than any of you've shown. I'll help finish that cabin. Count me in, the blacksmith added. Within seconds, half the saloon echoed with agreement. Clara looked around, realizing her once loyal circle had shrunk to a bitter handful. Vernon, seeing the tide turn, snarled, "This isn't over." Luke stared him down. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." The moment the words left his lips, the last of Luke's old fears fell away. Nora James wasn't facing this alone anymore. Tomorrow at dawn, they would ride to Bitter Creek, and they would build her cabin together. The next morning broke cold and blue, frost glazing the ground like thin glass. Nora stood outside her half-finished cabin, hair pulled back, eyes wary as hoofbeats echoed through the pines. She instinctively reached for her rifle until she saw who approached. Luke rode at the front, jaw set with quiet determination. Behind him came a dozen men. Moses, the blacksmith, 2 ranch hands, a retired carpenter, even young families who barely knew Nora but knew injustice when they saw it. They stopped in a loose line near her cabin. Nora's grip tightened on the rifle. "What is this?" she asked, voice sharp. Luke dismounted slowly, his breath puffing white in the cold air. "I was a coward," he said, loud enough for every man behind him to hear. "But I'm here now. All of us are. Let us help you build." Nora's eyes swept over the crowd, some familiar, some strangers, all standing with purpose. She didn't speak for a long moment. Trust was a currency she'd been starved of. But she saw something real, something steady in their faces. Finally, she nodded once. "Then pick up a hammer." The men got to work instantly. For 3 days, Bitter Creek's better half threw themselves into the cabin like it was a mission from heaven. The air rang with the rhythm of hammers, the scrape of saws, the crackle of fire as meals cooked in cast-iron pots. Nora worked harder than anyone, refusing to be sidelined in her own fight. Luke stayed close, matching her pace, watching for the moments when exhaustion tried to drag her down. They spoke little, but something between them mended with every board set in place. The walls rose first straight this time, reinforced and secured. The roof frame followed, then shingles laid tight enough to keep out any storm winter dared bring. A proper door was hung, solid and heavy. The floorboards were fitted snugly, each one pressed down with care. By the end of the second day, laughter had returned to the valley, warm, unexpected, genuine. Even Nora cracked a small smile when the blacksmith joked he'd never worked so hard without being married into it. On the third afternoon, the final log was set into place. Men stepped back, wiping sweat from their brows, admiring the sturdy cabin that stood against the Montana sky. But peace didn't last long. A cloud of dust appeared on the trail. Vernon Hale rode in with 4 hired hands in tow, all of them armed and looking mean. He halted in front of the cabin, scowling at the sight of the finished structure. "This property's under dispute," he announced. "You're all trespassing." Tools were set down slowly. Men straightened. Tension stretched tight as wire. Luke stepped forward, Moses beside him like a shadow. "The only trespasser here is you, Vernon." Vernon's hand hovered near his gun belt. Violence hung one heartbeat away. Then Nora stepped through the line of men, holding the deed in her hand. "This is my home," she said, voice steady as stone. "And I'm not leaving." Everyone braced for the explosion. But before a gun could clear a holster, a voice called from behind the group. The sheriff, watching from horseback, calm, unmoved. "She's right," he said. "Council reviewed your claim yesterday. Denied. You've got no business here, Hale." Vernon's face twisted with fury, but he knew he'd lost. One sharp tug on the reins, and he turned his horse away. "This isn't over," he muttered. Luke's voice followed him. "Yes, Vernon, it is." As Vernon and his hired men disappeared down the trail, the tension finally eased. Tools were set aside, shoulders relaxed, and air filled with the quiet hum of relief. One by one, the helpers offered Nora gentle nods, proud smiles, and words of encouragement before heading home. They had cabins, chores, and families waiting, but they left a piece of themselves here at Bitter Creek. When the last rider vanished over the ridge, silence settled over the valley, a warm, peaceful silence. Nora stood in the doorway of her finished cabin, lantern light flickering behind her, casting golden glow across the new timber walls. Luke stood just a few feet away, hat in hand, looking suddenly younger and uncertain in the fading evening light. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice quiet, raw. "I'm still scared." "So am I," she said, "but we build it the same way we built this cabin, one day at a time." She held out her hand. Luke hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her fingers slipped into his like they belonged there. She didn't pull away. They stepped inside together. The cabin felt bigger now, filled not with shadows but with promise. The table Moses carved stood against the wall. The fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth. The windows glowed a soft amber against the coming night. Everything smelled faintly of fresh pine and hope. Luke reached up, brushed a strand of hair from Nora's cheek, and kissed her. No fear this time, no guilt, no hesitation, just two battered hearts choosing the courage to beat again. Outside, the first stars pricked through the sky, cold and bright. Inside, something new began, something steady, something worth fighting for. Spring arrived slowly, then all at once. Snowmelt fed the river, wildflowers pushed through thawing ground, and Bitter Creek's valley filled with color. 3 months passed, and life found its rhythm. Nora stood on the cabin porch one morning, coffee warming her hands, watching the sunrise bloom gold across the fields. The small garden she planted was sprouting proud green shoots. A corral stood near the creek, Luke's horse grazing lazily within it. Curtains fluttered in the windows. Everything felt different now, not because the cabin was finished, but because she wasn't alone anymore. Sunday suppers turned into small gatherings, laughter spilling into the yard. Moses told old ranch stories. The blacksmith brought pie. Young families stopped by with seedlings and tools. And Luke? Luke found his smile again. The rare kind, the genuine kind. Some folks in town still glared. Clara's circle had grown small and sour. But Bitter Creek was learning, slowly, stubbornly, that judgment couldn't kill what community chose to build. One evening, as Luke repaired a fence post near the barn, Nora watched him from the doorway. He caught her gaze and smiled. Soft, warm, true. She smiled back. The cabin stood solid against the Montana sky, smoke curling from the chimney. Wildflowers swayed in the soft breeze. She had built her home one log at a time, each piece laid with stubborn determination against a world that expected her to fail. He had rebuilt his heart the same way, one choice at a time, until fear became just another ghost laid to rest. Together, they'd carved out a future from nothing but grit, kindness, and second chances. They stood side by side as spring rain began to fall, soft, renewing, washing the past clean. Luke slipped his arm around her. Nora leaned into him, and together they whispered the truth they had earned.